All right, welcome to HT with Dave. If you're on the fence about getting a hair transplant, stay tuned for this week's HT FAQ. It's a double acronym. Maybe I should change that. Well, folks, thanks for joining me today. We're going to be looking at some of the considerations that you can ask yourself whether or not a hair transplant is right for you. Spoiler alert, it's not for everybody. Also, we're going to be looking into what the recovery and some of the limitations that you can expect during the first few weeks of your hair transplant. So, without any delay, let's jump right in. All right, so for our first question today, this one says, I'm 22 years old. I'm starting to get a receding hairline. It's affecting my confidence with women. Should I get a hair transplant? Okay, this is a big question, and I think it's the most important question you can ask yourself if a hair transplant is right for you. Now, one thing we do know about hair loss, more specifically male pattern baldness, it's all about genetics. And unfortunately, that means a lot of this is out of your control. That's a tough pill to swallow when you're only 22 years old. There are arguments that there are external factors, stress, poor diet, and other environmental factors. But by and large, it is genetics. And for me, at 23 years old, that's when I first noticed my hair loss. It was actually my hairstylist that pointed it out to me. And from that point on, I began to get self-conscious about it. Now, at 24, I went to a local consult. It was a Bosley clinic, and there weren't as many back then, but they quoted me some outrageous price, and they would have sold me a hair transplant. And I am so glad that I didn't have a hair transplant at 24 years old. And here's why. What we do know is the average age that men lose their hair starts around 30. If you're losing it in your younger 20s, there's a good chance that you're going to have a more advanced hair loss, which means you're not done losing your hair. If you were to get a hair transplant right now, it would be a small procedure. It would cover those smaller areas. And then if you did nothing else to help preserve your hair, the area behind those transplants would start to recede, and you would end up having kind of a bald, patchy area behind the transplants, which is a very unnatural look. I highly recommend trying other methods to either slow or stop your hair loss before even considering a hair transplant. You want a good foundation to build upon, and the only way you can really do that is to take control of what you have first. Taking finasteride is one of those. Rogaine could possibly help you as well. And then other things that you can do to kind of hide it. And I think even though it might seem kind of like a cheat, it can certainly buy you months and years if you use some hair topic fibers. And that can just fill in those smaller areas. And it can look quite natural if you're good at applying it. So what that will do is it will kind of help give you a better idea and gauge whether or not your hair loss has stabilized or plateaued. You can go into any hair loss clinic and they will sell you a hair transplant. So it's really up to you to educate yourself before you even sit down for a consultation to figure out if it's right for you. And for me, that age was age 32. All right, so here's a list of 6 questions you can ask yourself before getting a hair transplant. Number 1, is your hair loss stable? Now this could be either, are you treating it to prevent further loss? Or are you at an age where your genetics are indicative that your hair loss has stabilized and you haven't noticed further hair loss? That is key before you ever go and sit down to get a procedure. Next on the list is hair type, hair color, hair density. Everyone is different, and so is everyone's hair type. You might see a picture of somebody who just had a 2,000 transplant or a 2,000 graft transplant, and you go, well, my hair loss isn't even that bad. I won't need that many. Well, if your hair is thin or very straight, or maybe the contrasting colors of your skin and your hair is more than the picture you're looking at, there's a good chance that you're going to need more grafts than what you're looking at. So just know and have reasonable expectations that depending on how far along your hair loss is and your hair type, one procedure just might not cover it. Next on the list is a short hairstyle a deal breaker for you? Now that might seem kind of obvious, but I think there's some naivety, but people thinking that they could get a hair transplant and there won't be any visual scarring. Well, I'm here to tell you, I've had both procedures. if you get an FUT procedure. They say it's about a pencil line width. Mine's probably a little bit more than that, but it does prevent me from going to a 3 guard or less than a 3 guard. A 3 is fine, but if you're used to getting a 2 or a 1 buzzed on the sides, that's going to be a problem. If you're with a FUE, DHI method like mine, I do think so far that scarring is much less noticeable. But if you have 2 procedures with DHI, you're going to have kind of what they say, a moth-eaten look if they're over harvesting those areas. So long story short, there's really no scar-free method. So just keep that in mind. If you're used to shaving the sides or buzzing them down and you want all that hair on the top, you're going to have that scar and you're going to be forced to have to wear a longer hairstyle or have a visible scar. Next on the list, basically social or work restrictions. Some people just aren't able to take that week or 2 off from their obligations to be able to recover. Is it a necessity? I mean, depending on your job, I would say you definitely want to have that time to recover because you might not be looking, it might be distracting to some, to put it that way. And then also, you could be uncomfortable if you have, certain healing with the stitches in the back. You're going to just want to relax at home, probably sit down, catch up on some TV episodes, and relax. Number 5 is unrealistic expectations. That's a big one. I went into my first transplant thinking 1 procedure, that's all I need. And even when they advertised, they said, well, you'll have about 30 to 40% density in the front. Well, what exactly is that? The tools that they used for my FUT procedure 4 years ago were not the same as my DHI FUE method. And what I mean by that, the spacing between each follicle was further apart. That is one of the reasons why I decided to go with the DHI FUE method, so I could get a closer density. But you're typically, if you have hair like mine, you're kind of rolling the dice of whether or not a single procedure to cover this much area in the temples. You can't forget that. The temples take a lot of space, and I have a little bit on the crown. A single procedure is just maybe not realistic. And I think at the time, of course, everyone with their first procedure thinks they're only doing 1 procedure. And some people get away with it. But when you get your hair wet, you can't cover that with fibers. And when you have very thin, it almost looks kind of unnatural when you have all these little spots in between. It just came down to making it look natural. So that's kind of my little take on unrealistic expectations. Last on the list is cost. And that might seem obvious, but this is a financial obligation that you will have to consider. Now, if you get your hair transplant done in the United States, you can anticipate paying quite a bit more. If you're willing to travel and you trust the clinic, it could be very advantageous. To put in perspective, an average transplant is 2,000 grafts or more. Even the cheaper clinics locally, they're $3 or $4 a graft. The simple math is minimum $6,000 for a hair transplant. And that can increase very quickly. It also depends on the method that you use. That is the cheap method, which is an FUT, strip method. The FUE method involves them individually pulling each fiber out, much more labor intensive, and the price goes up. So oftentimes clinics have different prices depending if you go FUT or FUE. Now to compare that with my procedure, I had 3,200 grafts using the DHI FUE method. That cost me 3,000 euro, which is roughly 3,200 US now. If I had done that in the United States, it would have been upwards of $13,000 to $15,000. So if you're willing to travel and you find a reputable doctor, it can be certainly worth the cost of an airplane ticket. All right, for this next question, this one says, is a hair transplant permanent, and are there other hair loss remedies? Well, the short answer is yes, a hair transplant is permanent. If those hair grafts survive those first few weeks, there's a good chance those hairs will grow for the rest of your life. What we do know about the hairs that's transplanted from the backs and the sides of the head is that they're surprisingly resistant to hair loss. If you ever notice, some of the old grandpas have that Bernie Sanders look. They're bald up top, but they have that band of white hair. That's because that hair will just continue to grow. Now, there are currently 2 FDA-approved drugs that treat hair loss. Now, there are a lot of shampoos and vitamins and potions, and some actually might be successful, but they're not backed by the FDA, and we won't go into those. The 2 that I'm referring to are finasteride and minoxidil. Let's start with finasteride. What is it? Well, originally named Propecia, it went generic in 2006. It's a 1 milligram tablet that you take once daily. Its design is to limit the production of the hormone DHT in your body, which is responsible for the hair loss. Now, with any medication, especially ones that can affect your hormones, it can cause side effects, most noticeably a lack of sex drive. Now, although I've been taking it for 4 years and have not noticed that problem, I have spoken with several people who have noticed those and have had to stop taking it. Please keep in mind that finasteride is not designed to regrow hair that you've already lost. It is designed to help slow or even stop future hair loss. As of right now, finasteride still requires a doctor's prescription, but you can get that from your local general practice. The cost for finasteride has really gone down, and I can get a 90-day prescription filled at Costco without even having a Costco membership for around $10. Now, the second FDA-approved hair loss treatment is called minoxidil, also known as Rogaine. Now, instead of a pill form, it's actually a topical foam or liquid that you place directly on the scalp. Now, unlike finasteride, Rogaine or minoxidil is designed to actually regrow hair, and it's targeted mostly for the crown area. In fact, most users report no difference or change in the frontal area. So if your focus point is on the crown, Rogaine minoxidil might be a good solution for you. Now, it's important to know stopping either of these 2 treatments will result in further hair loss. So it's important to consider them as a lifetime commitment. For me, as an airline pilot, and I travel quite a bit, my schedule is very irregular, which made minoxidil very tough for me because I would have to have it in my hair for a certain amount of time, and I found it was just tough to be able to allow that kind of time either in the mornings or the evenings. So it just wasn't a product that I could use on a daily basis. Other approved devices are using laser combs and wearing laser hats and helmets. You know what? If you're considering spending $1,000 to put lasers in your hair, you do you. Okay, so next question we've got, what can I expect during the initial 1 to 2 weeks after a hair transplant? Well, that's perfect. Today is October 30th, which means it is exactly 2 weeks after my procedure. So I'll go ahead and just show you real quick how my healing is going. Right now you can see the top. The hairs are all actually growing. I didn't expect that. Most of these will actually shed over the next few weeks and then come back as really strong, vibrant hairs. But in the meantime, they are growing, so I do know that they are living, they're doing well, and you can kind of see the temple areas. And then I'll show you the back. And of course, you can see that linear scar from my first surgery. You can also see the shorter hair. So you can see very, very, very small dots where they took the donor hair with the DHI method. And then the top you can still see is trying to grow through as well. So that's the 2-week update there. To be honest, I am I've changed my mind about the FUT strip method. Having that scar is a lot more obvious than the scar that you get or the individual scars that you get from the FUE method. So I guess, if I had to do this all over again, I would probably just go with the DHI FUE the first time around, and of course see the results and see if I needed a second procedure, and if I did, just have another one of those, because that linear scar really does prevent me from being able to have my hair as short. Okay, so back to the question, what can you expect within those first 1 to 2 weeks after a hair transplant? Well, redness and swelling are both very common, the degree of which is just based on your skin type and just the way you react to it. Everyone's a little different. The darker skinned people typically don't have the redness like the fair skinned people like me. It has been 2 weeks, so the redness is more just kind of a light pink in the front, but those first few days, it might be quite red, and it might not be something that you want to be in public for. So plan on that. Another couple things too, if you had an FUT strip procedure, you will have stitches on the back of your head. those will be in there for 2 weeks until you can go back to the clinic or have someone else remove those stitches. I think that would be technically a con because with the FUE method, there are no return trips to the clinic after the initial day or two of just the checkup. So going back to that, those stitches, they do give some tension in the back. And I do remember sleeping with an FUT procedure was uncomfortable those first 2 weeks after the procedure. With FUE, the first few nights, of course, are uncomfortable. In both cases, you will be sleeping semi-upright, usually on a neck pillow of some kind that they will usually provide for you. And you want to stay elevated so blood doesn't come up to the head and increase bleeding. But you have to sleep on your back. Those grafts, especially if you are getting any of the temple grafts, again, everything's very fragile at this period. So you're sleeping on your back, the back of your head, and you're not really allowed to twist and turn too much. So definitely something that's, I would say, that one of the biggest struggles for the first couple nights. But then after, I think, night number 3, I was sleeping pretty regular, pretty normal at that point. And after a week, that's when it's pretty much everything's back to normal. Even though it's typical to be prescribed pain medication, it's very unusual to have moderate or severe pain following a hair transplant. If the clinic does a good job, and depending on your procedure, they're really, honestly, after a couple days, I wasn't taking any pain meds at all. And I'm a strong believer in not taking them unless you think you really need them. The redness can be controlled a little bit by some of the medications, aspirin, and there's also anti-redness meds that can be prescribed as well. Those things can help with the redness. As far as swelling goes, having a band that goes actually around the head, that really helped me a lot, as I could tell all the swelling stayed above that sweatband. So very effective. There's also corticosteroids that can be prescribed, and I was given some of those as well to help with that swelling. Unfortunately, everyone's a little different, and some people get extreme swelling. If you aren't careful about how you sleep, or you aren't using a band or something to help prevent it, it is possible you could have extreme swelling. You can see some of these pictures. They are not fun. And it is probably a good idea to give yourself that week, if not more time, to plan for that time off and recover. All right, some of the limitations you can expect after a hair transplant might surprise you, but those new grafts are very fragile, and any trauma that happens to them might prevent them from growing. All right, first on the list is no pullover shirts, and that is true also for the procedure as well. Your clinic will tell you to show up with a button or a zip shirt, and that's to prevent you from having to pull that shirt off afterwards and potentially dislodge those new fragile grafts. Next on the list is no hats. Of course, that's obvious, but those hats can have harmful bacteria in them if you've sweated in them. But of course, more importantly, it's that extra contact that hat might have with those new follicles. Third on the list, no showers. And although that's not entirely true, you can shower, you can't have direct water pressure on the recipient sites of your hair, as that could dislodge those new grafts. Also, hot and really cold water are damaging as well. So you'll want to use kind of a lukewarm water and just use a cup or some sort of a container to wash your hair gently before that 1 week period. Number 4 on the list, no sweat-inducing activities. Kind of a broad statement, but that includes working out, saunas, jacuzzis, and yes, even sex. So if your wife is anything like mine, I recommend getting a spatula or a stick of some kind just to remind her that it's not quite 2 weeks if she gets a little aggressive. My wife is gonna kill me. And next on the list is no smoking. That should be obvious, but smoking constricts the blood vessels, and those blood vessels are what carry oxygen to your hair follicles. Yes, they are living, and without that oxygen, they will die. Plus, smoking's bad for you. Seriously, it's the year of the COVID pandemic. Stop smoking and use that money to pay for a hair transplant. One of the things that I struggled with that's really not on the list is just being careful overall with your surroundings. I'm 6'3", so I'm a fairly tall person. Getting in and out of airplanes and cars, I had to be a little extra careful with where my head was. After day 7, if you've survived and so is your hair, it is hallelujah, awesome. Awesome, awesome, because you can start going back to showers, you can have regular pullover shirts like this, you can wear your favorite hats again, and Basically, life resumes normally. Obviously, there's a few other limitations we mentioned earlier, but those aren't showstoppers. Well, that's it for this week's HT FAQ. I'll be doing another one of these next week, so please keep the questions coming. If you haven't yet already watched my 2-part documentary on our trip to Paris and Istanbul with my wife, please go ahead and watch that and consider subscribing so you can track my progress and watch next week's episode. Well, my hair loss isn't even that bad. I won't even need that much. It's very important. Oh no, I just got a beep.